So this component doesn't actually really need too much styling. All we'll do is we'll remove the margin and the padding, and then we're just going to want to remove the list style type. So we'll set the list style type to none, and you'll see that just removes the bullet points and it removes the margin and the padding around the list. So before we move on to further building our app, there's a couple of things I want to do for a bit of housekeeping on this component. So there's two things. One of them is anytime I'm building a component which has props that you pass props to, it's a good habit to get into to use the prop types library. And what that essentially does is it, for yourself and for other developers that might be using this component, it kind of acts as documentation. So it'll give you a warning if the props that you're passing in aren't of the right type. So this task's prop here should always be an array, because we are using an array method to loop through this prop. So we want to make sure that any developer using this in the future, or if you accidentally pass in, say, just a variable, you want to make sure that that's caught early in the process, so that it's not causing issues if you've deployed the app live. So all that is you want to import prop types from the prop types library. So in the background, I'll install that. I'll just stop my development server and then npm I prop types. So when that's installing, so all you do is you do the component. So it's task list dot prop types. So that's camel case, lowercase p at the start there, and that's going to be equal to an object. And now what this object should do is each key of the object should be each of the prop types, or the props that you're passing in. So for tasks, we want to make sure that it's of prop types type array, and it's always required. So we always want to make sure that whenever this component is being used, that the tasks prop is always an array and it's always required. So now that we've got this in place, if we try to pass in an incorrect type of this prop, we'll get a warning. So if we start the development server again, we can see this in action. So if we open up the Chrome Developer Console, you'll see an error there at the moment, and that's actually the second housekeeping thing that I'd like to address for this component. But if we go back to our app.js and we pass in anything but an array, so if I just typed in a string of tasks, what you'll see is, other than the obvious errors in the page here, you'll see that our prop types library has said that invalid prop tasks of type string, it's expected to be an array. So it's just kind of documentation for anyone using that component, really. So if we pass back in the array, you'll see that error has cleared up. So that then takes us on to the second bit of housekeeping for this component, which is with React. If you're ever rendering a list like we're doing here, mapping through a data source and spitting them out in a list form, essentially React needs to know the key for each child. So as you can see here, each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So what that's expecting is for each element that it's rendering out from the list, it needs this key. So that's why for each of our tasks, we also want a task ID. So if we just put the task.id, and each key of a React list needs to be unique. So we need to make sure that our task ID is unique, which currently they are. They're just numbers 1 to 4. If we save that now, our app will re-render and that error will be gone. So what I'd like to do now is to actually move these task items into its own component, and then that way we can style them separately from how the list is styled. So what we'll do is in our components folder, we'll create a new folder called task, and then within that we'll do our task JS file. So going back to what I said earlier about the structure of these is if I open my component, and actually what you'll see in this in the task component is these styles can get quite long, and personally I don't really like opening a component and the top 100 lines or so of the component to just be the CSS. I want to see straight away the markup of the component and how it works. So what we can do here is we can move this into its own styles file. So if we create a styles.js file, in here we'll need to import styled from style components, and then what I'm going to do is just grab the styled call there, and then I'm going to export that as default directly there. So and then when importing this, we can just import styled task list from styles, and I just personally think that's a much neater way of structuring your components. You'll see the benefits more of that in our task component because there's going to be more styles there. So straight away we can add our styles.js file, and we can import styled from styled components, ready for us to style our task. So our task component, first we'll need to import React from React, and then our component is going to be called task, and again that's going to be a functional component. And what that is essentially just going to do is it's going to take the task prop, so we're just going to hand it a single task, and from there we want to destructure the ID and the body. You don't have to do this. I just prefer being able to call the ID and the body on its own rather than doing task.id, task.body. And then what we're going to do is we are going to return. It's going to be a list item, and that is just going to spit out the body, and then we're going to export that as default task. So nothing will change, but we then want to move our task list render to use that task. So import task from, we're going to go outside of that directory, and then use task, and then task. and then we'll render it here. So we'll still need the key, which will be the task ID, and then we want to set the task prop to our task. We're passing through the whole task object, as later on we'll need the task ID when we are building the functionality to remove each task. So we can now get rid of the list item and save, and as you can see, that's now rendering out the list as it was before, but we're now using the task as its own component. So now we can start looking at styling our task component, which is the individual task that you see in our app there. So what I'm going to do is export default, just like we did for the task list, and that is going to be a styled list item. And then if I save that, and then we can import that in our task. So we'll call that styled task, and we're just going to import that from our styles. And then we will be using that in place of our list item here. So what we'll want is we want to add some padding. We'll do 20 pixels by 10 pixels, so that spreads them out a little bit more. And I think the effect on hover is I want to decrease the opacity a little bit. So I'm going to do the transition. Is going to be the opacity, and that's going to be 250 milliseconds, and we'll ease that in and out. Every other task I'd like to have a slightly different background color, so that can be nth child, and that is going to be the even child, so each of the even child. And our background color we're going to set to ED. So that splits them out a tiny bit, and then on hover, so you can see here we're writing this just like SAS, so we can use the and symbol to nest our styles, which I think is really nice. So on hover we can do opacity to 0.4, and we also want a cursor on there to just be the not allowed cursor, and that's it for our component styles. But you can see kind of if this was in the top of our component, I personally think it clutters the file too much, so I like to split it off into its own styles.js file and then import those. So now that we've got our task list and our task components all set up, we can move over to building the input so that we can start writing in these tasks ourselves rather than relying on a hard-coded data source. So if we close out all of our files, and then in components we can create a new folder, and we'll call that task input, and then in there we'll have our task input.js file, and then we'll also create the styles.js file. So from our task input file we can import React from React, and then we can go ahead and import from our styles, and what we're going to be importing is the we'll call it the styled task input from styles. So this component is going to be just a simple input field. We could wrap that in a form as well, but we're going to call it task input, and that is going to be a functional component. we will be passing down, so when we start to build the functionality, so whatever we type into this component needs to update our state, which will manage our task list. We'll be passing down the handle submit function, so that we can pass back up to our app.js file the given task that the user has just typed in. So we will be pulling that from our props later, but for now we'll just get the structure there. So we're going to return a form, and in there is just going to be an input, which is type text, and we can have a placeholder for now, which could be something like your task. And then if we export that as default, we can then plug that into our app component and see how that looks. You don't have to worry about this for now. That's just because we're not exporting a default or anything at all from our styles file. But if we go over to our app.js now, and we can import task input from components, task input. So we'll need to slightly change what our app component returns now. As thing as we want to return more than one component, we need to wrap those components in either a div, or that's if you don't want another DOM node like a div surrounding your application. That's exactly what the React fragment is used for. So that's if we import the fragment, how that works is we can now surround our components, I suppose, in this fragment, and that's essentially, you can think of that as an invisible DOM node, basically. So it won't render a div or anything, but React needs one component, one DOM node essentially as the highest parent of a component, to which then wraps its child components. So you'll see that if we create our task input, which needs to go at the top, so you'll see that at the top here, if I remove fragment and just return two components directly, not wrapped by anything, you'll see that React complains, and it said that adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So that's exactly what the fragment is for. There is a shorthand way of writing this, which means that you don't need to actually import fragment. So if we get rid of the import, what you can actually do is just omit the actual fragment word and just have these opening and closing crocodile tags, and then close that off as well, and that is essentially the same thing. So if we save, React knows that that's a fragment, just the shorthand version, and then everything renders properly again. Now that that's in place, we can start styling it, just to bring it in line a little bit more with the style for the rest of our app. So over in our styles file, in our task input, we can import styled from styled components. We then want to export default styled, and now this is going to be a type of input. And the styles we want is, we want to remove the border, we want it to be full width, we then want some padding, 20 pixels by 10 pixels. We'll give that a font size of 16 pixels, and then a background color of ED. So if we save that, so nothing will change until we actually use this import. So we can then just replace our input with our now styled input, and click save, and you can see that the styles have moved across. So that's all the styles that we need for our task input. And before we move on with any functionality, you'll see that we still have some styles from our body. So you can see that there's this gap here, and that's actually being enforced by our body. And then to stop this, so because we're using padding, it's now pushing our 100% width input here kind of past the scroll of the screen, and we don't want that. So there's a few global styles that we want to add. So as I said before, styled components, kind of the main benefit of them is to keep our component styles compact and just within each component. But another great feature, and you'll find on most of your apps you'll need to do this, is you also want to add global level styles. So whether that's for maybe you want some font styling for your headings or your paragraph tags, or you want to, like we need to do here, remove our margin or padding from the body. With this, what we can actually do is we can use another import from the styled components library. So what we can do is go over into our app JS file, and if we want to import, it's called create global style, which is exactly what it describes itself as. So that's from the styled components. If we save that, so what this acts like is it acts like another component in our DOM tree essentially. So up here we can define a global style, and we're essentially just going to call this create global style function, and that uses this template literal format. And then just like we have for our other styles, we can then just start typing our CSS really. So it's super simple. So here I want to take the margin off, and then to make this work is you just create your new you take your new global style tag and then just import it like you would any other component, and you'll see there that it's removed the spacing around our app. So we still have this issue where our task input component is overflowing our body of our app. So to fix that, we can essentially add some styles to all of our components, because I personally like to add this style to all of my HTML elements so that they all behave the same, and that is essentially the box sizing. I want to change that to border box, and that essentially means that when you add padding to a div, rather than adding to the width, so say for example you had like here an input field which is 100% width, but we have padding of 10 pixels each side, so rather than that input being 100% width plus 20 pixels, this will take it away from the width essentially, so it will still be 100% of the width, and the padding will be kind of inside and not take away from the width. So if we save that, you'll then see that that fixes the issue, and our component isn't overflowing our border anymore. So one last bit of styling I like to add to all of my side projects is I don't like this default font. I don't know exactly what it is, but I tend to like to override that, and the font that the font stack that I like to override that with is actually the fonts that GitHub uses. So you can just go on GitHub and inspect their body tag and pull this off, and I just think it's really nice. So if you're on an Apple Mac like I am, it'll use the Apple system font, and then it'll have all of these fallback fonts, and I just think it looks much nicer. So if we save that, I personally just think that's a lot nicer look than the default font. So before we start building the functionality for the application, I just want to quickly explain how we're going to do that. So we're going to keep track of our tasks in our app state. So that will be using the useState hook. And essentially what that will give us is the tasks as an array, and it will also give us a set tasks function, which will essentially enable us to give the task to this function, and then that will update our state. So that will be at the application component level. So what that will then do is it will pass the set tasks function down to the task input. So that will be given as a prop, and then in the task input it will track what the user has inputted into the input field, and then we'll send that back up to the app, which will update the tasks state, which will re-render our app, and our tasks will then be fed like it is here into our task lists, and that will update. From there we will then store those in local storage. So on our initial app load, we will search in local storage for any local storage data whose key is tasks. We'll initialize our state with that. If there's nothing, we'll initialize it with an empty array, and then on update to our state, we will also then set that new task to our tasks array in our local storage. So we'll start writing our functionality for the app in the task input component, and this is when we'll use our first React hook. So what React hooks are essentially a way for us to use things like state or context without having to write a class-based component. So I personally much prefer functional-based components, so I think they're a lot neater. There's a lot more code, I suppose, when writing a class-based component, and so I personally prefer functional-based components. So hooks allow us to then use state and things like that in our functional components without having to convert them over to a class-based component. So the first hook we're going to use in our task input component is the useState hook. So essentially, as it reads, this allows us to use state in our functional component. So how this looks is you define a constant, and what we're going to do is we're going to destructure our useState function that's given to us. So it returns us an array. So this is essentially how you use the useState hook. So with ES6 we can now destructure things like arrays, and what useState will do is it will pass us an array with two items. So the first item of the array will be the value of that piece of state. So in this example, what we want to keep track of in this bit of state is our task, or what the user has typed into this input field. So we will track that by mapping it to our task bit of state. The second thing that the useState function returns to us in the array is a way for us to update this task value. And how you tend to name that is set and then whatever you've called your value. So set task, or if it was fruit, you would do set fruit or something like that, for example. And then you can pass in a default value for our state. For now, we just want to leave that as an empty string. So we can then start using these values in our application. So currently task will just equal an empty string because that is what we've initialized this useState hook with. And then this set task is a function, and whatever we pass that function will update our state, and then we can get that updated value through our task constant. So now we need to find a way of actually tracking what the user is typing into this input field, updating our state, which will then in turn update our application state, update our task list. So how we'll do that is we'll track what they are typing with the onChange event handler. And what we'll do is we'll pass this an arrow function, which will then hand off to a method that we will define called handle change. And what we want to do is we want to pass the value of the input at the time that the user is typing. So how we'll do that is we'll store the current state of this input as E, and we'll pass that into our handle change. Seeing as we only have one parameter here, we can just omit the parentheses. So we then need to define this method. So we'll do const handle change, and that's going to be another arrow function. We are taking in this E value, and that will be an arrow function. So what we need to do then is all we need to do is hand this off to our set task function. So we can just type set task, and then what we want to pull from this input field is E, and then you get the target, and then you just want to pull off the value from that. What you could do is, rather than handing it off to this handle change method, you could just directly handle that there. So move the set task function into this onChange event listener, but I tend to like to hand that off just in case down the line we need to add a bit more functionality or anything like that. So if we save that now, we can actually see that update of state taking place if we console log our task state. So if we save that on initial run, what you should do really is put this in a use effect hook, but this is just to show that the set task is updating our task state. So on initial load, you'll see that there has been an empty log, which is just showing our initial value. So I could change that to high, and you'll see that it will log out high. So that's our initial value, but we want that to be blank. And then every time we type, you'll see down here in the console that is keeping track of everything the user types and stores that in the local component state. So what we want to do now is, if we just remove this console log, we actually want to take over control of the value of this input from our user. So the reason we want to do that is because when we hit enter, or when the user hits enter, we want to add their task to the state, but then we also want to clear that input field. So a way of doing that is actually taking over the value of what the user is typing into the input field. They won't know this because it's mapping directly what they are typing, but we'll just have control over the input, and we can clear that at any point that we like in our component lifecycle. So all we'll do is the value of this component will just map back to our task state. So on initial load, it will be blank, exactly as the user would expect it. And then every time there's a change, or that the user has inputted some letters or numbers into the field, it then handles a change which set task which updates our state, which will re-render our component and in turn update the value of our input field. So we can see that if we refresh, we can see that in action. So everything that the user types into the input field is mapped directly back, but we are tracking that in state and then in turn returning the value of the state in the input field. So now that we are able to store the task that the user has just inputted into our task input component, we now need a way to pass that up our component tree into our app component, which will collect all of our tasks, pass them to our task list, and also map those tasks to local state so that we can persist those on app refresh. So this is when we'll utilize React hooks again. So in our app component, we'll call in the useState hook from the React library. And rather than directly returning our JSX in our app component, what we'll do is we'll turn that later on in our arrow component, in our arrow function, sorry. And then just like we did in the task input, we are going to use state. So as previously, we'll destructure the array that useState gives to us. And what we can do here is, rather than directly pulling from the tasks, just this task constant here, and passing them directly into our component, we can actually initialize our state with these values for now. Later on in the course, we will pull these from local storage, but what we can do for now is pull these out of here, initialize our state with the tasks, and then we're going to call them tasks, and then also set tasks. So this is the same naming convention that we used in task input, but you can use whatever names you want here, just as long as you know that the first value that we're destructuring from the array is the current state's value, and then the second value that we're destructuring from the array is our function to update that bit of state.